I will hand over to our wonderful Anthea to lead our speakers and panelists today. Thank you, Anthea, and welcome to our speakers and audience.
Thank you, Kirsty, for the introduction. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are joining us here today. As Kirsty said, my name is Anthea Laurence, and I will be the moderator of this panel discussion. As you know, the discussion for this year's Partner Power Summit is around climate justice, and each day of the summit, a different topic under the climate justice umbrella is addressed. Today, we will be speaking about racial and indigenous inequality and how addressing it will help to combat the climate crisis. Before going any further, I will introduce you to our wonderful panelists for today. We have Precious Akampumuza from UNFCCC, Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform, and Joanna Reed Johnson from University of Reading. Now I would like to invite the panelists to make their opening statement and introduce themselves, starting with Joanna Reed Johnson. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for that introduction. I'm just going to read something to you in terms of my opening statement and then link that to what I'm currently involved with. So I think education is really key in addressing racial and indigenous inequality so that we can combat the climate crisis. It's through education for sustainable development and education for all that I think this is possible. I think a very quick and easy way to start to embrace this is by exploring the Sustainable Development Goals and their intersectionality. I'm going to, Hela Lotsa-Siska in 2019 stated that we can break education and think about it not in terms of inside, i.e. the teachers and the institutions, but from what perspectives are out there. And I think this is really key and important, that we constantly look out beyond our own little silos in a way of what we're doing. Now, my research has explored that out there in terms of looking at whole school approaches in relation to systems thinking. So it's about joining up the dots. And I think by joining up the dots, we can empower agency, and it's through exploring dilemmas that exist out there and helping others to think about seeking solutions that this is possible. And it, as I said earlier, it's about education. So as the director for climate and sustainability education at the Institute of Education at Reading, I'm currently exploring ways to empower our teacher trainer educators and also our training teachers. And it's about them exploring what's out there beyond their boundaries. So the key principles in our initial teacher education framework is about developing not just the knowledge, but the attitudes, the values, the behaviours. And most important, moving towards developing those competencies and capabilities. So I think by exploring how things naturally occur in racial and indigenous communities, we can learn so much from that. So it's about empowering those marginalised groups and actually seeing what's happening in those marginalised groups, exploring them, considering the dilemmas that are being faced by these groups. And through engaging people to think about their own positionality, who they are, where they're coming from, what informs their practice, I think we begin to understand our own unconscious biases. So, as I said right at the beginning, I think it's really education is one of the key drivers for helping us to move this agenda forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. Now I'd like to invite Precious to have her opening statement.
Thank you so much, Anthea. My name is Precious Akampumuza from Uganda. Currently, I'm a climate fellow at the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat here in Bonn, Germany. So I'm so happy to be part of this discussion, because at first when I received the email about it, I looked at climate justice, and for me, I've been, studying about climate justice, which is depending on who defines it, and depending on the context. I think generally we are talking about a concept that addresses just division, fair sharing, and equitable distribution of benefits and the burdens of climate change, but also the responsibilities to deal with the impacts of climate change. So climate change is real, and we also know that it exacerbates the situation of the minority communities, or the people who are already in the vulnerable position, because their situation becomes even harder when climate change impacts set in. So I'm hoping to add on that. Also, in my work as a climate fellow, I do work with local communities and Indigenous peoples platform, and I'll talk later more about this platform, which is an open and inclusive space where we aim to have the Indigenous peoples share their experiences and the good practices and how societies can live in harmony with nature. Thank you so much, and let's talk more later.
Thank you, Precious. Now I'd like to ask you, why are climate change and racial Indigenous inequality linked? Would you like to go ahead of that, John, please?
Yeah, I think Precious did kind of touch on it there. And there's a couple of things that I'm just going to read to you. That understanding about climate change requires us to ask fundamental questions about the assumptions that underpin our disciplinary practices, because often we've education's been siloed into different disciplines, and there are points of alignment within which decolonization agendas have happened. So as Precious just said, it's really about us kind of questioning that, where have our education and systems evolved, and in respect of learning, I think it's really important we learn from the expertise of Indigenous communities and non-Western knowledge systems, because that's how we can develop agency on a global scale. And I think understanding learning, the forms of knowledge of learning are important, as this can be held within those Indigenous communities. And I think it could be really powerful and insightful for people to explore that. In particular, I've done that in South Africa and in England when I was looking at eco schools. And interestingly, the way in which Indigenous communities in South Africa were working was really insightful. And I think if we can put these stories to people we're educating, they can start to unpack it and understand it and explore what Precious was saying about how the most marginalised communities are impacted the greatest by climate change. Thanks.
Thank you, Joanna. Precious?
Yes, thank you. Am I on mute? Okay, I'm good. Thank you so much. Yes, this is a very interesting topic when we talk about climate change and racial and Indigenous inequality, but we also have to tell our audience what exactly is climate change. When we talk about climate change, looking at the long-term shifts in temperatures and the weather patterns, and unfortunately human activities, like we are responsible, especially through burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, gas, among others, hence producing the greenhouse gases. And then we have climate change. But then we look at what are the indicators of climate change, where we have like the temperatures are rising, we have glaciers melting, sea levels are rising. And as a result of these indicators of climate change, we have floods, we have wildfires, heat waves, and droughts. Now, after having the results of climate change, the wildfires, the heat waves, and so on, they make the situation, they threaten our livelihoods. They threaten where we stay, our shelter, our land, our income sources. It happens that we have these inequalities come up as a result of the existing social and maybe political systems. And then they find us, or the minority or the marginalized communities, in a very vulnerable place, whereby they have limited resources, they have limited income sources, the land is taken away from them, for example, for different purposes, education is limited, and then the adaptive capacity of them is also limited as a result. Now, what happens is the impact of climate change in terms of diseases, food insecurity, shelter destruction, all combined now increases the burden on these communities. So this is how we have climate change, racial and indigenous equality interlinked. They're interlinked basically because of the place where climate change finds these communities. But also when we talk about education, it happens that, for example, indigenous knowledge is passed on from generation to generation and is also enclosed in the context where these people live. And so when people have to move, for example, because of droughts or because of floods, they have to leave their places, then we have these losses where we have both economic and non-economic losses. Knowledge is drained, it goes away when people leave. So what this means is the situation continues to be even harder and hits them the worst. So I think briefly that's the relationship between climate change and then racial and indigenous inequality. Thank you so much.
Thank you, both of you, for that explanation on how it linked. Now, Precious, I would like to ask you, what role can the Indigenous youth play through the local communities and Indigenous people's platform to enhance exchange of experience about mitigation and adaptation action?
Thank you so much, Anthea. At this point, maybe let me share my screen for purposes of seeing my slides. Let me see, and I'll request that once you see my screen, help me to.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Is it displayed in presentation mode?
Yes.
Perfect. So now the question asked to me is, what role can Indigenous youth play through the lCIPP, that is the local communities and Indigenous people's platform for mitigation and adaptation to climate change? Now, we have to first talk about what is lCIPP, what is the local communities and Indigenous people's platform. Now, this is an open and inclusive space. It brings people together and their knowledge systems to build a climate resilient world for all. So broadly, that is lCIPP. And this platform has 3 functions. These functions include knowledge, where this platform should promote the exchange of experiences and best practices with a view of applying, strengthening, protecting, and preserving traditional knowledge, among others. That is number one, knowledge to the function. Then we also have capacity for engagement, because most of the time the Indigenous peoples have been left behind, and now this platform has to bring in the Indigenous peoples and also local communities to enable their engagement into the UNFCCC process. So we have to build capacity of parties to engage Indigenous peoples at the national levels into decision-making processes. So we do build capacity for the Indigenous peoples and local communities as well. Lastly, we talk about function number 3, climate change policies and actions. So this platform facilitates the integration of diverse knowledge systems, the practices and innovations in designing and implementing international and national actions, programs and policies in a manner that respects and promotes the rights and interests of local communities and Indigenous peoples, among others. Now, with these functions, how do the Indigenous peoples come in? What is their role? Now, under this platform, we have a work plan. At the moment, the work plan is running, and it is a 3-year work plan from now till 2024. Under these functions, we have activities. For example, I'll just highlight number 1, activity 3, where we talk about curricula and education. Now, under this activity, for example, we have Indigenous peoples, people from local communities share their experiences in different ways. They send in materials to have it posted on the web portal. We have a web portal specifically and have space for the materials they share for everyone to see and learn. And this material, remember, it doesn't have to be documented only. It can be in form of chants, it can be in form of videos, it can be form of stories, because Indigenous knowledge is captured differently. It may not be written. So if you have it in form of video, in form of a folk song, feel free to send it, for example. So the youth, those who are doing research in communities, participating in NGOs at grassroots, feel free to bring in, especially the youth. Feel free to bring in this work. Now, that's activity 1 under knowledge function. But we also have a cross-cutting activity, which is activity 8. And in briefly, we call it Youth Roundtable. And this is dedicated specifically for the youth, where we shall host an annual roundtable in collaboration with Indigenous youth and youth from local communities, as well as with broad and gender-balanced youth representation from each of the United Nations Indigenous socio-cultural regions. So you have to make sure people come in, representatives come in from the different socio-cultural regions of the United Nations. And then it has to be gender responsive at the same time for knowledge sharing and continuing to strengthen the practices on the ground for everyone to learn and then contribute ultimately to climate policies, actions at both national and international level. So with that, I would like to call you to join our community today. Feel free to email us if you have any questions. We shall respond to you, and then also visit our website for more information. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Precious. I would like to ask Joanna, how do we address racial and Indigenous inequality to combat the climate crisis through education?
Well, I guess similar to what Precious was saying, there's sort of several steps to take. And I think one of the first things is important to for educators to understand their own positionality. I mentioned this a little bit earlier as well. So understanding their position on teaching these issues, teaching about climate justice, where's their thinking come from. So for example, myself, I you know, look like a white Western middle class person, but there's lots going on behind what I've done and where I've been and what's influenced my thinking. So I was brought up in Africa, in Nigeria, and you know, obviously a lot of colonialism existed, but it did impact on the way I think or see things. And then in my later career, I've worked in different parts of the world, in Singapore teaching, and also working on research in Singapore and South Africa. So, you know, all that, I think it's really important that the individual reflects on that and thinks about who they are and where they're coming from and how this influences their perspectives. And that's exactly something they can then go and do with the children or young adults that they're working with. I also, and then it's, as Precious also mentioned earlier, is about the importance of understanding what these key terms mean and how they interrelate. And then it's about actually getting people to, so we could talk about all the doom and gloom about climate, you know, what's happening with climate change, these islands are sinking, you know, the water's taking it over, these deprived communities have got to move out of their communities, how are we going to save that? Okay, and that becomes quite undoable because it's just a lot of eco-anxiety, particularly for young people. So then it's about how do we develop that agency? How do we help young people or even older people to think about what are the solutions? So that's about asking questions, presenting information, getting them to think about it, getting them to problem solve, getting them to consider the dilemmas and possible approaches. And then also, if we think of any organisational context, including schools, it's about getting people modelling what should be happening in practice. So in terms of this racial and Indigenous inequalities, how do we map that out? You know, what are our leaders doing to help communities model this in a more equitable way? And finally, I think it's about learning by doing, so that these principles aren't just about us presenting all the knowledge to people, but it's about how that knowledge is presented, the processes through which people learn, and learning by doing is a key way in which to engage people. So hopefully that gives you kind of a flavour of my views. But I'm quite happy to take questions, but also for people to get in touch with me later. I can post my email for you to get in touch. Thank you, Anthea.
Thank you, Joanna. So how do we teach this and empower our students and others?
Is that for me as well?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think it's not necessarily just teaching the content and the knowledge. It's about engaging people in the process. So my work at the University of Reading, we want to embed this throughout our teacher training programs. And it's really important that we engage our students who are training teachers in that process so that their voice is heard. It's about them having a voice, and that we foster pedagogies of participation rather than pedagogies of power, which is inherent in our systems. You know, it's inherent into why we have racial and Indigenous inequality. So it's about, you know, modelling that and helping our training teachers. Aren't all young people, some of them are older as well. But it's about modelling that so that then when they're in their school settings, they can model that them to their young people.
Okay. Now we will take questions from the audience. If the audience has any questions, they can write it or raise their hands and we can ask them. Now we have a question from Daniel. He said, what do you think is the root cause of environmental racism, and what do you think is a good way we can stop this? Who would like to answer it first?
Go ahead, Joe, if you would like to comment.
I was just trying to work out what Daniel meant about environmental racism. If he could just type a clarification or come on speaker, perhaps, what he was meaning by that. Oh, here he is. You could unmute and just ask.
Yes, I meant like I think there's like the pretty much the most basic clarification, the racism in racism well, there's inequality for there's inequality for racism, so they have not have heard their voices. They talk for climate change, the climate crisis, pollution, something like that. I'm not sure.
So about getting people to have a voice.
Yes.
From marginalized communities. Yeah. Well, I think it's really important is providing, you know, actually, as an educator, it's about thinking of what this mix of people are and how am I going to address each of those communities. So one example with my teacher training hat on, I was talking to some colleagues yesterday about how in primary schools, so younger children, how our training teachers could think about this issue of racial injustice, social justice, climate justice. And one way we got to think about was actually, well, let's look at where these school communities are located, because we have a very diverse range of schools within our communities here in England. So it could be that our training teachers look at their actual socioeconomic mix within which they might be working and training, and then, you know, so that they become more aware of it and they have the discussions, they have the debates, and they consider all these different complexities which exist in our world. So I think it's about raising the question and getting people to think a little bit more about that. I hope that answered a bit for you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel.
Precious, would you like to add on to what Joanna said?
Yeah, thank you so much. So Daniel, thanks for your question. I think basically Joe has literally said it. It's about having a voice. Issues are being raised, for example, under the local communities and Indigenous people's platform. People raise their issues. They talk about what are they facing, and discussing with others, they are able to sometimes find solutions, because certain concepts are very complex, and to solve them or finding solution, it goes step by step. So starting small, for example, finding a community, sharing the same problems, but also trying to find the solutions together at the same time. So that is what I can add. Joe, you want to come in?
Yeah, I just want to add, if I could just add to that. I think it's important as well, people understand that, I think Precious sort of indicated this, about there might not be a solution, but there might be an alternative way of looking at it and thinking about it. And I think in particular, it's really important to discuss that, you know, so that it's realistic. The solution is or has to be something that's realistic and possible, not something that's just sort of oh, well, we need to do that because we have to do that. But actually, no, how are we going to make that work? And how can we be empowered to make that work? What are the different things we need to put in place to make that work?
Thank you so much, Joe. Yeah. Danielle, where are you based? Sorry to ask.
Oh, from what country I am? Sorry. I'm from North Macedonia.
Did I hear that?
Macedonia, was it?
North Macedonia.
North, yeah.
Okay, North Macedonia. Thank you. Thank you for joining us, and thanks for your question, Danielle.
Comfort, do you have a question for the panelists?
Sorry, not really.
Because we see your hand raised, that's why.
Oh, sorry, that must have been a mistake. Sorry, please. Sorry.
Okay. So I would like to ask our panelists, what message would you say, to the audience, to everyone listening to us, that there's a way to sort of reduce that inequality, to address that inequality, the racial and indigenous?
In a few words, I would just say that it's about raising awareness of it, because many people could just be totally oblivious to it. And it's about thinking of the consequences of that inequality. How does it affect those people? You know, why do they feel like that? What are the systems through which we can explore to help reduce that? And why is it important to reduce that? You know, the message is that so coming back to climate change, unless we address this for everybody, we're still going to continue with climate change. And that the greatest impact happens for those more, the racial indigenous communities who have more deprivation. So it's a global responsibility that we consider this and we think about solutions. And for young people, I would say it's about taking really like small steps so that they do feel they're making a difference. They're actually seeing the impact of their voice in making these changes.
Thank you so much.
Precious, go ahead.
No, I'll simply supplement what Joe just said. So climate change is real. It's non-discriminatory. It affects all of us, but depends on where it finds you. At the moment, most institutions, most people are talking about the power within the indigenous communities, the power that lies within the indigenous people, not talking about the nature-based solutions. You see, so we need to also know, what do we have to offer? At the moment, when we talk about climate change, you cannot go away without talking about what knowledge, what indigenous knowledge, what traditional knowledge can be applied. What climate change is affecting food, is affecting water, is affecting literally everything and everyone. You see, it doesn't matter if you have the cash, for example, but then if there is no food, where will you get it from? No. So let us, I think, briefly, we need to know that climate change is here and for everyone, but also think about how do we try to find good practices and be able to live in harmony with nature, because nature-based solutions still take lead in the fight against climate change. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I would like to ask Kirsty if we have any questions from Facebook Live.
Not that I can see at the moment. Let me just double check and I'll come back to you if there are.
Okay.
I have a question though, if we have time.
Okay, we do.
Okay, so thank you, ladies. Great answers so far. I suppose conservation and climate are typically seen as, the movement is seen as quite a white middle class movement. And unfortunately, many of us can't change our ethnicity or our social background, but how can we be better allies to support racial and Indigenous equality and the fight for climate justice? Any thoughts on that?
As a white Western person, I'm very conscious of that. And it is about connecting with those communities and learning from others. And sometimes, I mean, I remember being in South Africa in 2007 doing some research, and it was only several years later that I realized that certain learned responses that I had from children was yes, you know, yes, yes. It was more of a power relationship, that's how they would respond to me as a white Western researcher. So I think it is about being really aware of that and trying to understand that and collaborate. Collaboration is the big thing. We need to collaborate. You know, we need educating. So I look forward to carrying on collaborating with Precious and Anthea and all of you. Precious, did you want to follow on?
Yeah, you just said it. Without being aware of the existing situation, you would not think about it, literally. So you wouldn't think this is a problem. So is it a problem that we have, depending on how we do relate with these communities? If you see yourself as in a position, for example, of power or better position, for example, and have nothing to do with this person who is assumably marginalized or in a vulnerable position, that doesn't solve the problem. And Joe has talked about collaboration. Need to know, realize, and be aware. I think awareness is a simple but again complex. What do you want to be aware of? Aware that the problem is here and we need to solve it collaboratively.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you, ladies.
Can I just add, it comes back to that thing I said right at the beginning about Hela Lotsasiska, a professor from South Africa, would say about looking out to look in. You know, we and Precious has said about all this knowledge from these Indigenous communities. It is so precious. Yeah, it's precious. It's really important that we can learn from that, and that can be shared. Oh, I've got a love heart there. Thank you.
Thank you. Eva, you have a question for us.
Yes, thank you. I have a question for both of you, actually. And I have a question for Precious after. Racism, my question to both of you is, racism is hard to talk about. Do we need to update our communication skills to start a real conversation on racism? Because it's very hard. And I think we could use some guidance about talking about racism. And my question, my personal question to Precious is, can you open up a window to Japan in terms of climate justice for us? Thank you.
Do I need to answer that?
Well, I think we would like to hear like what is happening in Japan in your perspective, your personal perspective, and your experiences.
What is happening in Japan in terms of racism, in terms of what?
Climate justice, because like it seems like the life in Japan, as far as I understand, is clear and more sustainable than most parts of the world, can I say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I don't know if I have much to talk about that, but of course ready to explore and share any information after here. But when you look at it from the outside, yes, it looks stable, looks sustainable, but it would, I think you'd get a different perspective when you go on ground. You see, you wouldn't believe that you have maybe poor people in Japan. Japan is, for example, an earth-prone, earthquake-prone country. So I don't know if there is a relationship between like earthquakes and then we have flooding, for example. They are an island country surrounded by the sea. So I'm sure with the flooding and the landslides, regardless of the capacity that there is to maybe bounce back, but I'm not sure they would bounce back like before. It may be different context by context, but to be honest, if a flood comes and sweeps away everything, all in the name of sea levels rising, and then we have this climate change, it affects us. It may not be in a similar fashion, but definitely it has a huge impact on how the food comes in, on where it comes from, on how much you have to spend to make sure that the people go back to their places or have shelter, for example. So you are very right. From outside, it looks the way you have said it, but I think when you go to dig deep into how people feel or what is happening in terms of climate change, they may be in a better place than probably maybe better than the developing countries that are hit the worst by climate change, but then there is still impact, and that impact is still significant. That's what I can say at the moment. Thanks.
Shall I answer in terms of the conversations about racial inequality?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I can only draw on some of my own experiences of working at the University of Reading in terms of, I think those conversations are being had. At our university, it's a big driver. It's a part of our university strategy. It's a part of our Institute of Education teaching and learning forums. You know, these conversations are happening, and in terms of helping people to develop that understanding, but also, you know, it's always a challenge. So when we're trying to get people to have role models of their own same ethnicity, then that is a challenge, but I think it's something that's being worked at. Whether it's happening fast enough is another question, but yeah, I mean, I work with some really interesting people who work in that area, who are researchers, and also some masters and PhD students who are wanting to explore this area. So, you know, I find it all very fascinating, and yeah, we do need to have difficult conversations. People need to have that.
Yeah, actually, I had forgotten that there was a question about racism, and should we open up the topic? Should we talk about it? Now, it happens that personally, where I come from, if I talk from a personal perspective, I didn't know there is even a word called racism because it wasn't introduced to me. I never heard of it because a human being is a human being, period. Until I had to travel, and then I'm like, okay, so sometimes you're denied something because of how you look like. So to me, that had to sink in for some period of time. And now when you talk about opening up and then discussing it, I think sometimes we need to talk about it, especially if we think it causes some unwanted issues, for example. And also I also think that it depends on who perceives what and when. So some certain aspects may be viewed as racism, while others may not, depending on who. However, I do understand that why not? Why not discuss it? Mm-hmm. It's a topic, it's alive actually, that and should be discussed. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Precious and Joanna, for that. Now, I will just like to thank you for joining us today and having this discussion, which we understand it might be difficult to talk about it. It's a little bit a taboo in some places as well. And I would like to thank our audience for coming, and thank you.
Kirsty has a question. Sorry.
Thank you. I do know that's okay. Sorry, I just put my hands up. Thank you, ladies. I want to put a question to you that we put to the students that joined us earlier in the week. So they've been debating either pro or con that addressing inequality will combat the climate crisis. And they raised some excellent points about limited resources. And we're both sort of looking at the argument of, do you think that focusing on addressing inequality in itself is going to be enough to combat the climate crisis? Or actually would focusing more on the climate crisis in terms of funding and efforts do enough to solve inequality? So I wonder if you have any thoughts and perhaps which side of that you fall, or if you've got any other ideas. Open to both panelists. It's a hard one, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so maybe if I may jump in, we're talking about providing funds, right? And then we're talking about solving inequality, for example. But we have to know that these things go hand in hand. Mm. You see, there is nothing like be pro or be oppose, whichever side. They go hand in hand. If we have to study or learn what is hidden in the indigenous communities, and we believe that with these good practices, we shall get solution, then we need resources. And also we need to also first understand how does inequality also affect the others, depending on where you stay, depending on where you live and how you perceive that climate change is affecting you. And then think about what solutions do you bring on the table. So the interconnectedness of the system makes it difficult for me, in my opinion, to be pro or against whichever side. So I would love to hear that. It is, I understand it's a very, very interesting debate depending on who is talking about what, but I think they are interconnectedness. We cannot have one and leave the other out. It will not work, that's for sure. Thanks.
No, very well put, Precious. And I think as well that links with the idea that this agenda should be grassroots, to create change, to make it happen, to come from people's ideas, but also it needs that top-down commitment. So I think that relates to that relationship between, do we tackle the injustice or do we provide funding? I don't think just providing funding is the solution at all. And it needs to be provided in a thoughtful way that actually has impact rather than just blanket funding. I don't know if anyone knows, but in the UK, we just had the launch in April of our sustainable and climate education strategy. And so it's not a government policy, but it's a strategy to engage in this kind of debate and discussion and education across all age groups. But again, it's sort of slightly tokenistic, because I don't want to get political about this, but you know, it's that relationship between how we balance that, as Precious and really well put, and how we fund and support that in it. And it's about collaborating. So it's not just about us as educators, it's about all communities around us connecting up and thinking about complexity and understanding complexity. I think people need to get more comfortable with complexity.
Yeah, that's it, Joe. Thanks for putting it straight. I've heard of a story where we had where there was a flood swept away the equipment used by the fishermen by the shores of the sea, and now because some people are donating, so in their imaginations they think they need to send the fishermen boats, you know. So you just send money, you don't go on ground, you don't go to understand. But they didn't know that the men had already left because they are the fishermen. And then who is going to use the boats? Right? So it's not about providing funding, it's about collaboration and understanding what exactly is happening on ground. And then it is either bottom up or up down approach, but then collaboration comes in, because when you look at the at yourself being in a maybe in a higher position, not ready to understand what is on ground. I can ask you how many of us have been to the farm lately, but we eat every day. Now, if we don't understand the person providing the food and support them, then how are we going to survive? Right? So it's connected. For sustainability, the systems are connected and they go hand in hand. So we need to go back to the drawing board and understand each other, collaborate, and train ourselves to be aware of the existing situation. Thanks.
Thank you, ladies. I think the students will be really glad to hear that the experts were very much a similar opinion that they were, that these issues are very much interconnected, interrelated, and you can't solve one without solving the other. And both are obviously impacted in positive and negative feedback loops. So I think that will reassure the students that were debating earlier in the week that it is a really hard conversation and a really hard topic to think about. I've got another question for you both that we also put to the students. Obviously, in terms of the climate crisis, it's a matter of urgency. This is a time-dependent, crisis that's looming upon us now. So in terms of what do you think is the quickest action that can be taken, perhaps both at grassroots level and at government or national level, to try and resolve racial and Indigenous inequality that will have a positive impact in reducing the climate crisis? What do you think is going to make the fastest short-term benefits to both addressing inequality and the climate crisis? Any thoughts?
I think from the government point of view, it's about how, I mean, obviously I'm talking from the government that I know of, but it's about, I mean, it could be something like the Seychelles have done. They're making it integral to everything and it's being funded, etc. And Anthea could probably answer this better than I can. So I think that commitment, that's not just, because we have the challenge of, if something is a strategy, educationists won't necessarily do it. But I do also understand the conflict between the subject we're talking about and the fact that it is meant to be grassroots evolved. But I just think if you don't have that top-down commitment, the grassroots needs that kind of carrot to pull it along and make it happen. I think that's the quickest. It's not easy. I don't think it's easy or quick, to be honest, but yeah, it's complex. Precious.
Yeah, it's a question I also put to myself sometimes. Why? Because we are all talking about climate. I work at the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat. We are talking climate daily, and sometimes I get to ask myself, why are we talking about this every day? Okay, it's affecting us, threatening our food systems, threatening the water systems, the health system. Everything is crumbling, that literally, and no one is going to be left behind, if I might say. But then the quickest fix, if we are talking about, I've heard in some corners that even if we stopped the fossil fuels, still it would take some time. Temperatures would continue increasing for some time. But if that's the major contributor, is it possible to stop them? Is it possible to phase down or phase out the use of fossil fuels? Because it's the major contributor of climate change. When climate change comes, everything crumbles, right? So now that is, I cannot say it's the easiest. Climate change is complex. And then I cannot say that's the easiest solution, but it's a contributor, because we are talking about, for example, the energy sector going for renewables. For example, that means we are cutting down on emissions that are the major cause of climate change. So what if we cut on the emissions heavily? Then we are going to the positive direction. Because when we talk about adaptation, for example, that means we are learning to adapt and not talking about solving the problem. So we need more money to do other adaptation. But then if we focus on, for example, the side of mitigation and reduce, then we need to adapt less.
Yeah.
So they are opposites. Continue your gas production, the emissions, fine, you'll continue to think about adaptation strategies. This requires more money, which money and the other enablers are not in the communities, the indigenous communities, for example, and other marginalized communities, people who are living in slums, for example, not necessarily indigenous peoples. So it's what it is, but we need to think about reduction of gases, gas emissions, which will lead to now we don't need to adapt. And then when we don't need to adapt, then somehow we get to have people live better, even those in marginalized communities, because those in marginalized communities, their shelters are weak, no insurance system. If we cut down and have less flooding, then probably we have taken a step towards the positive direction. That's my opinion.
And I just add one small last thing, because it links with what Precious has said. The actual, these more marginalized communities, that there are a lot of product innovations out there that haven't necessarily been pulled through yet, because, you know, manufacturers want to maximize on the things they've already manufacturing rather than leapfrogging to the next innovation. And that actually these marginalized communities would benefit by leapfrogging, so they don't go through the transition that the industrialized developed world has gone through, but they just leapfrog to the best technology that reduces that carbon output, etc. That's it.
Great. Thank you, ladies. A very complex subject. There's lots of different threads and strands that are all woven in a real tight knot that is difficult to unpick without, you know, sort of adjusting the rest of the knots. Comfort has shared in the chat with us as well after your comments, I think, Precious. It's also about ensuring that the support is not hijacked, but is monitored, and to make sure it gets to the Indigenous people and communities themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's a good point. Thanks, Comfort. Yeah, that's correct. These monies that come from whoever, they need to go down to the recipient, and the recipient should be the exact recipient. That's right. Thanks.
Anthea, it doesn't look like we've got any questions from our Facebook audience, and I think that's all of the questions in our chat and Q&A answered. So I'll hand back to you to round us off.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you our panelists for joining us and speaking with us about this interesting topic. I would like to invite the audience that there are other workshops and panels that will be happening this week as well. And you can keep engaging on our TSL.earth community platform. And visit us on social media just to stay updated with the sustainability and programs that are going on. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Wonderful. Thank you.